Hello and welcome to Fit After 40. I'm Chris here with Tony, and today we're going to talk about running and running injuries, prevention, recovery. Our guest is Sean Roach, who is a doctor of physical therapy and the founder of Aletheia Run. And we'll talk a little more about his product here in a minute. Sean, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, both of you guys, Chris and Tony. Thank
Good to
you.
have you.
So let's begin with just your experience here. Working with runners, especially runners over 40. What do you see? What types of injuries do you see that are common among this group?
40 and up, I see probably not a whole lot of different injuries than what I see in the younger individuals. Yeah, in my background, I would say often over 40, a lot of patellofemoral pain or anterior knee pain, a lot of plantar fasciitis, a lot of Achilles tendonitis, a lot of hip pain, a lot of what people oftentimes refer to as sacroiliac pain. Those are probably the most common. Usually, so I would kind of summarize that by saying lower extremity injuries.
Okay, and of course you have designed a device that kind of identifies running patterns that make people more prone to these. Is that correct?
That's correct. One of our hypotheses, I'm very careful being a researcher, there's a big difference between the word hypothesis and theory. And the hypothesis is where I'd say where the majority of all of us are. So our idea is that most of these lower extremity injuries are a result of non-symmetrical loading forces going into the soft tissue and into the bones and joints. So it could be that when you're running, there's more weight being distributed on the right side than the left side, as an example, or in the front of the foot or the back of the foot. So the goal of this device was to figure out, can we make the body more symmetrical between left, right, front, back, and top, bottom? But again, that's a hypothesis. Yeah, we don't know for sure that that's because you can find many elite runners, or at least at the elite level, you can find runners that run fairly asymmetrically, which we can measure objectively, that they're running in that fashion, and yet they don't tend to have injuries. So it's again, it's our hypothesis is that you run more symmetrically, distribute the loads, you're less likely to have injuries, and you're much more likely to improve your performance if that's your goal.
And I think improving performance is a goal a lot of us share. When you're working with a new athlete, what is the first thing you look at in terms of an evaluation to see what this injury risk looks like?
Let's say, for an example, if I'm a physical therapist and an athlete trainer, if you came in to see me as a runner, probably the first thing I would do is I take a pretty thorough history. I spend a lot of time, I would say, profiling patients, trying to figure out what is it that you're here for? Are you here for your fitness? Are you here for health? Are you here for competition? Can you give me a little bit of your background? I'd like to figure out the way people see the world. Their belief systems are more important than the biomechanical assessment. So I spend a significant amount of time, even when I'm doing an evaluation, talking to patients, trying to see how they see the world. Do they have a little bit more of a magical look, a little more scientific, a little more religious perspective? All of that will strongly color the intervention that I apply. And I would say from a physical perspective, probably the number one thing I look at with runners is their hip mobility, especially hip extension, the ability to take the hip backwards of the trunk. That's a key. I've actually published 2 studies looking at the relationship between lack of hip mobility and chronic low back pain in runners, and also the lack of hip mobility and chronic knee pain in runners. And I've published both of those journals in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy, and those are free online if you go on PubMed.
Fantastic. And we will link to those in the show notes for those who are interested in a deeper dive. Let's talk about so hip mobility is what we're talking about here. Are we talking range of motion?
Yes. Hip mobility would be referred to as range of motion. And when I use the word stability, I would say what most people would refer to as strength. I refer to that as more motor control. So yeah, if we looked at the mobility, there's a lot of focus, let's say, in knee pain on the knee itself, where the pain is being generated. So most people will focus on, well, if the knee hurts, I need to strengthen the knee. And or many people are focused on the foot. I need to do better shoes. I need to do orthotics. I would say over the last 20 years, though, there's been a significant increase focused in running injuries on the hip itself. Now, what's interesting, most of this research was being done by Chris Powers at the University of Southern California, who's a friend and a mentor, a colleague. He's published well over 1,000 studies on lower extremity biomechanics. Again, a lot of his articles can be found on PubMed as well. I learned quite a bit from him in terms of hip motor control. But the question I had 10 years ago is, we have a saying in physical therapy is stability before, or mobility before stability. So prior to 10 years ago, there was not a lot of research on what was normal hip mobility, even in normal individuals, non-runners. So I went ahead and I talked to Stuart McGill, who's pretty renowned in terms of spinal mechanics. He's up in Canada. And I said, everybody's focusing on hip strength or motor control, but what about the hip range of motion? He said those studies haven't been done for the most part. There were a few studies out there, so I went ahead and did that. And so the key motion, I would say, would be the ability to extend the hip in back of the trunk. So let's say you're standing straight up, the hip would be neutral. When you go to walk, when the leg goes in back of your trunk, it should extend about 10 degrees. Now, when you run, the speculation, we don't know this for fact, it should be about double that. So when you're running, your hip should be able to extend about 20 degrees prior to the hip. Here's what happens though if you lack that hip mobility. What you'll do is you'll tilt your pelvis forward, what we refer to as the anterior pelvic tilt. What that does is that kind of it simulates hip extension, but it also brings your back into an arch position where it's a little more compromised to get injured. And so that's how people run, with a little bit more of a curvature. They'll bring their shoulders back, kind of arch their low back to make up for that. So they, instead of having good hip mobility, what they do is transfer the mechanical load into the lumbar spine. Now, the problem becomes then is that they start to beat up the low back. That could affect the neuromuscular control into the muscles of the hip and the knee. And now the knee starts to move in a fashion that's not ideal. Then we could end up with potentially chronic knee pain, oftentimes referred to patellofemoral pain. And then it kind of extends down the chain where it could affect the way the Achilles tendon and the patella and the plantar fascia is also being mechanically loaded. So this thing is just a mechanical linkage. So yeah, the hip mobility seems to be essential. Again, with runners, I said we need the hip motion before we work on the hip strength and or motor control. So that would be my key. I also look at the ability that they have to internally rotate. That's another important variable. However, when you look at the anatomy, everybody's anatomy is unique, and the hip joint itself may lack the ability to internally rotate very far. So sometimes you'll try and stretch that region, but anatomically, the hip may be designed in such a way that you won't have a lot of hip mobility to begin with in terms of internal and external rotation. So that's what a good clinician will do, is try and determine that to the best they can. And people are kind of, you really can't change your anatomy, but you can change some motor control strategies and maybe change the way you run. So, or maybe decide that running is not ideal for you, and or you want to change the amount of running that you do. Maybe
the volume, training load.
Volume.
Let's say someone does lack that hip mobility. To what extent can you address this with some kind of cross-training type of exercises? And what specific exercises do you typically recommend?
And specifically, what you can do is it's something called, if you go on YouTube, there's something called, you can look at hip flexor stretches. There's many of those by physical therapists, chiropractors, and so forth out there. Oftentimes we assess, you need to do this a little bit carefully to do it well. It's called the Thomas test. So if people want to look that up, and you can actually use the assessment of a lack of hip mobility, you can use that as a particular stretch to increase hip mobility, increase. So you can use the assessment if you lack hip extension, you can use that assessment as a stretch in and of itself. So there's many exercises on YouTube showing you how to increase that hip extension.
And is this something that the sensor that you've designed, the Aletheia Run Sensor, does it measure this hip movement?
Yes, it measures it. Yeah, that's one of the key variables or metrics that we're looking at right now. You see a lot of runners that have low back pain, in particular, around what people refer to as the SI joint. It's usually because there's too much compression. What should happen ideally with the body if you look at it as a machine, the pelvis should be able to anterior tilt and posterior tilt. And when the leg hits the ground, per se, the pelvis should posterior tilt. Then what happens when the low back straightens out is the soft tissue takes up more of the load. Then as the foot goes into more of a toe strike, the pelvis should anterior pelvic tilt to load the spine. So ideally you want this transition from anterior to posterior tilts to load and on to share the load between the bony elements and then the soft tissue elements. But if you're stuck in an anterior pelvic tilt because you lack hip extension, then what happens is the spinal elements become overloaded, and over time you can develop bone spurs, potential disc protrusions, facets, and irritation, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And is this what's referred to as a force portrait? Is that what you're referring to when or that would be a component, I suppose?
That would be a component.
Portrait.
So what we're using is our sensor goes over the sacral area, in the region that's specifically designed because that's where the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle loads kind of converge. As you're running, you'll see the right arm and left leg will move forward. That's how we transition the pelvic girdle and shoulder girdle so that the way they rotate. So yeah, what the force portrait is we use an accelerometer there's a simple formula or basic formula called force is equal to mass times acceleration.
Sure.
And so force and equals mass stays consistent. So if you and I are running, we look at force equals mass times acceleration. The mass is consistent, so we can take that out. So force and acceleration are equivalent to one another. Mm-hmm. So we're using our device as an accelerometer that generates a force portrait. And yes, and that helps us to determine whether it's a lack of hip mobility or a lack of hip stability, and or specifically right now, a braking impulse where the foot gets out, the heel gets out a little bit too far and forward of the trunk.
Okay. And how does that foot strike correlate with injury if your foot's getting too far out in front of you?
We refer to that as a braking impulse, which is also in the literature. If the heel gets too far out, it's a significant force that goes back into the body. It's like you hit the brakes really, really hard. So if you can increase your cadence, oftentimes you decrease. It's oftentimes because of overstriding. People are trying to pick up their speed by striding too much. So if you can increase your cadence oftentimes and then tilt your trunk a little bit further forward, you can oftentimes minimize that braking impulse. And you'll see this on the force portrait. We have a posterior view, a side view, and a top view. So the side view will show you if the braking impulse is too significant.
Mm-hmm. So the braking impulse is essentially heel striking is what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
So the idea that because you're not using your foot for any absorption at all, you're just sending shocks straight through the body, correct?
Yes. And we want to minimize, ideally, if you look at the body from a machine perspective, it has a lot of machine-like qualities and materials. The whole goal is to minimize the loads into the body so that it lasts for a long period of time. And I'm always confused when people want to argue about this. People will say, well, I've been running with this, let's say this large braking impulse for a long time and I've not been injured. And I'm like, well, good for you. But the goal is to last as long as possible.
Yeah, right.
I would think running, you want to last. I'm going to be 60 here very soon. So I'm hoping I can run for another 10 to 15 years. So the goal is, with this force sense, with the force portraits, it's kind of like a guardian. We're calling it the guardian of the run. It tells you if you're doing things that are not ideal for your body. Again, it's minimize loads and increase and improve your energy expenditure.
So you mentioned the accelerometer, which an accelerometer is a device that measures the direction and acceleration of motion. Are there other sensors that the device uses in addition to the accelerometer, or are you able to paint the full picture with that?
We can, at this point, I would say, without my technical people here, yes, we're primarily only using the accelerometer. There are other aspects within this device, but we have over 38 metrics. The challenge is it becomes too confusing for even the researchers. So we're trying to really minimize, and these force portraits are very unique. There's a little history behind this, I'll tell you in a moment, but the goal right now is to help people understand the three metrics of hip stability, hip mobility, and the braking, and that they can see that when you look at your force portraits, every one of us generates like a unique portrait. But all the physics people that are involved with me, at least initially, we thought most people would run fairly similar. And that's not true. Every one of
Huh.
us has a very distinctive running pattern, and the pattern can change over time. So one of the goals is, let's say you go out to run 10 miles. Let's say at mile 5, you look at your watch or whatever device that you're reading your force portraits on. It may be at 5 miles out of 10, everything looks good. You feel great. You look at mile 6 and you'll notice that there's a significant asymmetry now in your force portrait, but you're not consciously aware of it. So from a research perspective, the question is that where the tissue starts to break down? And then let's say you go and you finish up to 10 miles. Now the pattern is very asymmetrical. Is that one of the mechanisms? Now, had you stopped at 5 miles and maybe walked for a little while, let the body recover, would there
Sure.
have been a return to that symmetry? Would that be more ideal? Or so you'll be able to you'll capture this data over time, and over months and months, you'll figure out, oh, when I was running ideally, this is what I look like. But when I got injured, this is where I started kind of running through. I was ignoring this objective information, saying, well, I feel fine, so I'm just going to continue to run, despite the fact I'm spending 20%, 30% more of my time on the right side.
So that's something I find kind of interesting about your device, and you kind of got to what I was going to ask as a question next, and that is, um, and where kind of see how this device seems very useful is, so many times all of us here are runners, so many times when we're at our run groups and stuff like that, somebody in your run group gets injured, or maybe you get injured, and then the next thing you know, the other side of their body is injured, and that's because they've adapted their running to compensate for one injury, and then they've caused another injury. This device seems like it'd be pretty useful for catching yourself in those patterns ahead of time before you exacerbate the other side and cause more injury as a result of compensating for another injury.
That's exactly it. That's been the goal. We initially started this idea. When I moved to Eugene, I had always worked with runners, and I had actually started trail running. I moved from Detroit, Michigan area out to Port Angeles, Washington, which is in the
I
Olympic
love that.
Peninsula of Washington, and
Oh,
it was to
wow.
kind of raise our 4 children around the Olympic National Park. And I didn't have that much
Beautiful.
time. It is. It's one of the. It's yeah. And we've been away for 20 years, and I go back and I'm like, this has got to be one of the most beautiful places in the world.
I
No
love it
doubt.
there.
It's always cold. We were there for 10 years though.
It's always
We
cool.
lived right on the water, and it's amazingly beautiful. But since I didn't have much time, our children were all 4 children were 2 years apart. If I wanted to go up into the park, I didn't have time really for a hike. So I was running in 1996, 97. I just started trail running on my own. It certainly didn't seem like it was a very popular. In fact, most people thought it was kind of strange. Instead of walking the trail, I'm like, well, I don't have time to walk 10 miles. I'm just going to go run a 10-mile loop here. And then it
Right.
became more popular, certainly over time. But yeah, I'm much more of a proponent of running on trails, which is also very popular in Eugene. There's trails everywhere, especially from the little kids running to the older people to all the Nike elite runners. So yeah, and so what happened in Eugene is I had an opportunity to work with runners of all levels. And then I got an opportunity to start working with one of the Nike elite teams. There were 3 of them in Oregon at that time. And that was primarily working with the 800 meters. But I was also very fortunate to work with Dathan Ritzenhein, who is a 2 or 3 time Olympian for the marathon. Got to know him very
Wow.
well. Um, so I purchased a treadmill. It was a very, very expensive research treadmill, a pressure sensor treadmill. And what we noticed with this treadmill is it creates a butterfly pattern. And we noticed that when the runners were injured, they had a very asymmetrical pattern. But
Hmm.
as we did the rehab and their pattern became more symmetrical, it was usually a result. They would also say, hey, I don't have these injuries anymore, or I'm getting better. So the question came, we did about 40,000 what we call instrumented gait evaluations. So we'd also use video capture, the pressure sensor, and we use something called surface electromyography, where you put electrodes on the muscles to see what muscles are active, like the
What,
gluteus maximus or tensor fasciae lata.
which muscles are
And then,
engaged?
yeah, so yeah, that's extremely important, and it's a very negligibly used tool uh,
Hmm.
within sports medicine, which makes no sense to me. Uh, so the question became, how do we take this ability to measure gait outside off the treadmill. And that's where we started
Right.
working for the last 7 years, designing this device to take it outside and running on the track. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. So the question you have with the elite runners, I always remember talking with Dathan about this. I haven't talked to him in a few years, but he wouldn't disagree. He said, Sean, if I was running 10 to 20 miles and that was the plan, even if I became asymmetrical, I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to
Right.
push. I'm going to push right through the 20 miles. I said, yeah, that's why you were always injured. And
Well,
he laughed. It's extremely. I think the world of Dathan. He's one of my more favorite people. I tell him that, and he always laughs. But he's a very reasonable. He's coaching back, I think, down at in Grand Valley now, or Grand Rapids area. So, but I learned a lot working with him, probably more than some of the other runners, because he was very successful. But when he was injured, he also listened very well. So the other runners I was working with at Nike were primarily 800-meter runners, and they were also very fascinating, but very distinct.
Sprinters.
Yeah, they were the 800-meter basically became a sprint. Those guys were probably I would say if you had an ideal running body, it would be the 800 meters at the elite level. They were fairly muscular. They were very quick. Yeah, I think they have ideal bodies, both the men and the women. It's a good combination of both the endurance and the speed and strength.
There's a lesson in there somewhere about track work. I think the speed work that a lot of us distance runners don't enjoy, but it is important, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think your body type definitely dictates what you're going to drift into. It's like the 800 meters certainly they were not thin. I mean, a lot of them were 5'8", 5'9", or a little bit taller, but fairly thick from a muscular perspective. I don't think they would not have been ideal long distance runners. And then you look at the ultra runners, I think a lot of them are more about my size, which is about 170, 175, and I'm designed to last for quite a long time. Whereas if you talk to a lot of marathon runners, at least the elite ones, they would have zero interest in doing ultra marathons. At least the ones I talked to. I'd always ask Dathan, I said, would you do a 100-mile run? He said, absolutely not. he said, no, 26 miles was good enough for him. So
they push hard enough on those 26 that they're putting forth almost as much effort as those 100-mile runs, I think.
The last thing I remember working with Dathan, it's been quite a while now since he's retired, but he was one of the first Americans to run the half marathon in under an hour, or just at the hour. So that was pretty exciting.
That's incredible.
We had one of our previous guests. He's a 2:13 marathon runner, and he was on, and he's run some trail races, but yeah, he pretty much sticks to that. I'm always trying to push him. I'm like, Patrick, why don't you go run 100? Why don't you run a 50? He ran 150 one time, the one in Leadville, and came in second place, and he was good with that.
Yeah.
So speaking though of trail, since we're kind of talking a little bit about trail now, with the sensor, I'm still kind of fascinated by the sensor when you're kind of using it in these kind of off-camber situations, like a trail where you're up and down, one foot's higher or lower than the other. Is this a functional
the terrain
tool?
Varies.
Yeah, and varying terrain, or is this more of a tool that somebody would use on just on a track?
No, you can definitely use it anywhere. And this tool, we're in the first version right now. All of my team wants to move on to second version, but I said, hey guys, we got to look at this from a business perspective. I'm working with nothing but scientists. None of us are business people here. So I said, we're self-funding this. We're at a point we've been working. We put a tremendous amount economically in this over 7 years. But yeah, there are different settings that you can set for running on trails. But the question would be, with that variance over time, I think when we get to version 2 and version 3, with the feedback that we get from the ultra runners and trail runners, that device is going to get better. So no, you can use this on the treadmill, you can use it on the track, you can run outside with it. One of the big challenges we have with the trail running, because one of our researchers is a trail runner, is that we kept losing the Bluetooth connection. So this device has taken, if I would have known 7 years ago what it was going to take to build this device, I would not have done it in retrospect, because Rachel and I, my former wife, I mean, we were business partners as well. She's it's been a very challenging venture here economically, putting this thing together. But I just had no appreciation for how complex the technology was. We also have a group of 4 engineers over in India that we work with that on the Bluetooth. But the Bluetooth itself was very problematic a few years ago out on the trails. We kept losing the connection. But now what you would say is if you didn't want, right now the device is limited to use with the phone. However, we're not very far from using it with like the Garmin watches as well. But you could either
Nice.
carry the phone with you or you could put the setting on your phone, leave it in your car, and it's going to collect all that data that you can download when you get back.
Oh, so the device will store the data on board.
Yes. Yes.
That's helpful because you're not going to look at it in the middle of your run anyway. You're going to look at it when you're done.
Yes. I would think, although the younger people tend to be looking at their phones nonstop, I've noticed when they're on the trails.
Yeah, fair enough.
That was kind of my next question is kind of walk our listeners and us through what the typical use of one of these devices. So say I'm going out on a run. Is this something that I would probably wear like my watch all the time when I'm running, or is this something that you use selectively on runs? And then afterwards, my interaction with the application and stuff like that, what kind of data am I getting when I'm looking at the app and so on? Just kind of maybe give us an idea of what typical use of this device would look like for the average runner.
Okay, so let's say I'm going to go out and do maybe, let's say a 5-mile run. Our device is a little belt that you click around, you take it and you put it around your waist and you center the device. We call it the Aletheia, which is a Greek word for disclosure. So it discloses how you and the world are interacting with one another. You tap on your phone, you set go. You can either carry the phone again with you or put it in there. And what it's going to do, it's going to collect that data. Let's say you run 5 miles. It's going to collect you'll have a timestamp so you can look at what it looked at 1 mile, 2 miles. It collects data about every 30 seconds. So you could look at this in great detail when you get back, or you could stop in the middle of the run if you wanted to and look at the data at that point as well. And then all this data is going to be stored in the cloud. So the goal is to look at it over time. Let's say you run 3 to 4 days a week. You can look and see if there were differences in your force portraits. And what we're going to do eventually is all of your data will go in with other people's data in the machine learning to look for specific patterns of when we see injuries. Because what we're hoping from a community standpoint is that people give us feedback on the website. It's like, this was my force portrait and I ended up, when this pattern looks this way, unique to me, as I'm started getting a lot of Achilles tendon irritation and I was running on a flat trail or I was running on a hill. That's the type of data that we need to put into the machine learning. One of the things to kind of go back on this a little bit with the force portraits, we took 100 individuals of various ages. This was actually a real study. It was human subject approved. We took 100 subjects over the last 2 years. We did a 3D capture analysis, and then we did what we call isokinetic biodex strength training. We looked at hip mobility. So we took a bunch of objective measurements. We put it into the machine learning and matched it up to their force portraits. So these are not this. So we know when we look at these patterns, what is likely to be going on, whether it's an issue at the knee, the ankle, and or the hip or the low back. Now it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good, and it's only going to get better. I mean, we have 1,000 subjects, 2,000, we get to 1 million. We should be able to look at these force portraits and say, okay, there is where the problem is. That's the goal with this device.
Sure.
Because one of the things that's also unique to these patterns, I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole, is we use something called fractal mathematics to evaluate these. And the fractal is just a really unique self-replicating pattern. A fractal, an example would be in nature, would be a tree where you have one stem and it splits into 2 and it self-repeats. Those force portraits are fractal in nature. And Richard Taylor, who is one of my, helps out on his website quite a bit, he's the head of the physics department and he's the world-renowned expert on fractals. So 2 of my employees were former PhD students of his that have graduated, one with a PhD and the other one with another graduate degree. So yeah, there's something very unique about these patterns, but we need a lot of data. So just kind of simplify, if you were going to use it, you would get out of your car, put the belt on with the little sensor, set the sensor on, set your phone on, and then set go. And then when you get back, all the information stored and you can kind of drag it across and see, okay, mile 1, mile 2, mile 3. Oh, wow, that's interesting. Look from the backside, this force portrait became very asymmetrical. Or you look from the top down and you notice maybe, wow, why was I rotating to the right or rotating to the left
Hmm.
more so. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of data because it's three-dimensional. Again, the top down gives you a lot of information. Like I said, when you run, ideally, there's a very strong connection between the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle. So let's say when I'm running or I'm walking, if my right leg goes forward, that means the pelvis would rotate a little bit to the left. So I counterbalance that by bringing my left arm forward,
Uh,
opposite arm, opposite leg. So I tend to minimize torsion. If I were to just, if I go to, let's say my right leg goes forward, rotates my pelvis to the left, then I bring my left shoulder too far forward. Now what I'm going to do is get some asymmetrical loading. I'm rotating my shoulder girdle way too far to the right in relation to how far I'm rotating my pelvis to the left. So then what you'll do is end up like, think of it like twisting a towel. I'm twisting the top too far in relation to the bottom where I really want that pelvic shoulder girdle symmetry ideal. What's going to take up the load if I'm torsioning too much? Usually the spine.
So
And
it's
that could be
back
one of
pain.
the mechanisms. Yeah, if we just look at it from a,
Back pain is how this is going to manifest.
yeah, and if you look at I taught a class at the University of Oregon, an upper level class, graduate level class on functional anatomy of the spine mechanics. So I know the literature pretty much inside and out on why the low back breaks down. And usually it's from excessive shear and excessive torsion loads and or a combination of both. The body's more designed to handle compression and tension. You can make an argument for that. There's always nuance. But yeah, it's the excessive torsion and shear that ends up breaking those elements down over time. And the challenge you get into with running, maybe ideally you can run for 3 miles, and then once you become fatigued, the body, it's unique. It's like if we were doing, I do powerlifting. I'm kind of limited. Once I get fatigued, I can't lift heavy anymore. I got to stop.
Right.
Whereas with running, you get fatigued, you'll just keep running. And so what
yeah.
happens
Slower. Yeah.
instead of mechanical load getting shared between, we would call the contractile elements, which is the muscle, and the non-contractile elements, which is the fascia, the cartilage, and so forth. Once the muscle becomes fatigued, if you keep running, you could make a good case. Okay, the mechanical load now has got to get transferred into the other tissue. Again, maybe the meniscus or the Achilles tendon.
Which is
That's
where
where
you'll.
we think the mechanical load, yeah, it's the
Huh.
excessive mechanical loading into these soft tissue elements or non-contractile elements. So if you could ideally, you could know when your body's becoming fatigued and stop and say, okay, that's where my baseline is right now. You know, I can run 3 miles and not get fatigued, but it seems if I run 3.5 to 4, now my system's getting tired. Okay, now you know what the data is. Now you can design a more effective training strategy, you know, to work on your endurance. And or you say, oh wow, on the force portrait, it looks like my hip stability, I'm great. My hips are staying pretty symmetrical side to side. But once I get to mile 5, boy, I've got a lot of hip drop over to the right side. And hip drop is another very, very important variable that we can talk about if you like in running. It may be one of the key elements. So
This is not something I've ever thought about in terms of running, so I would love to hear how this impact. Yeah, yeah, I'd love to hear more about
okay.
that.
So again, what we would look at, like if I were to do an assessment with you guys, the first thing I would look at would be hip mobility, would be hip extension, hip internal rotation, so forth. Then the next thing, the next element I usually evaluate is going to be the gluteus medius and minimus strength, which are the muscles on the side of your hips. So usually you lay people on the side, have them raise their leg up and see if they can resist you. So the muscles on the side of the hip, their primary function is when you're running, let's say you're running, you jump on, you land on one leg. You want your pelvis to stay level, but let's say the right side hip muscles are weak. What will happen? They won't stay tight. Well, let's say they're weak. What will happen is the hip will drop on that side of weakness. So I land on my right side, my hip muscles are weak, my hip will drop over to the side, and as it sways too far to the right, something has to stop that. And what that's usually going to be is the soft tissue. Now, here's something that's interesting about the difference between men and women. And there's a lot of biomechanical studies to back this up, especially with Chris Powers. If I'm a female and I land on my right leg and my right lateral or the right outside muscles are weak, my hip will sway to the right, too far from the midline, and my trunk will tend to continue to lean more to the left. So we call that an uncompensated. Yeah, you'll tend to sway more. So the hip will go to the right and the trunk will lean away. So it's like you're tilting every time you run.
Right.
So what's more common in females? Well, the more I tilt away from that hip because of the hip drop, I'm going to end up oftentimes with bursitis in the hip because the hips I'm getting too much shear out on the outside of my leg, and I could end up with what we call IT band syndrome or lateral knee pain syndrome, lateral ankle syndrome. Now, men will do something different. Instead of it, they will, if their hip drops to the right, they will lean their trunk over the side that they're falling to. So we call it a compensated gait. So what we'll give, the hip will drop to the right, and then the trunk will lean over it. So what we do is we get a lot of excessive shearing right at the lumbar and the sacral region over that side. So women will tend to lean away, and men will tend to lean toward. So there are different mechanisms of, you'll see different presentations of injuries oftentimes in individuals. I mean, you have to look at, there's always going to be nuance and there's going to be variance, but in general, men and women tend to move very differently. We have different strategies.
And is strengthening the glutes in the gym a good strategy for avoiding this? You know, we see those adduction machines at the gym where you kind of spread your legs against resistance and that type of thing. Is that the application for those types of machines and those types of movements?
Yes, that's the intention. Now, here's where the whole system, this is where it all breaks down, especially with runners. And a lot of it has to do historically with physical therapy, and it has to do a lot with the way in which physical therapists get reimbursed. If I want to test whether the gluteus medius and minimus or any muscles working, ideally I need surface electromyography. So if I lay you down, I would put electrodes on these muscles. So when you move a muscle, it generates an electrical current. So let's say you're in my clinic, what I oftentimes do with runners is I'll take electrodes, I'll put them on the side hip muscles, I'll lay them on their side, and I'll do, like, let's say a clamshell, or I'll do a bridge. Even though I might feel that muscle tighten, that doesn't mean it's electrically active. What may be happening is that whole leg and the muscles and the fascia are connected. So it may be when you go to do a clamshell, it could be the hamstrings and the quadriceps and the muscles in the lower leg, they're tightening and they're making the hip tight itself. So it appears to be tight. So what I do with runners is I use electromyography to determine whether the muscle can function, like let's say, with clamshells or leg raises and so forth, because oftentimes people are prescribed an exercise randomly, like the adductor or the abductor machine. I don't know whether that would work. Hypothetically it would work, but I don't know that unless I put the electrodes on. So what happens oftentimes is physical therapists or coaches or well-intentioned individuals, they give exercises, but they don't use any diagnostic tools to figure out whether that exercise is actually working the muscle. Now, the reason that in general that we don't get reimbursed in physical therapy for these tools. So like the surface electromyography unit is probably you could probably pick up a decent one for $8,000 to $10,000. I have a $20,000 unit. I don't get reimbursed for it. There's not a lot of incentive for physical therapists to use them. And then the explanation usually is, well, it doesn't matter because when I give the patient the exercise, I can feel that muscle tighten. But I can give you a great example here. I'm a very competitive power lifter. I'm ranked right now, elite international. So I train with some of the best people in the country. I've got a training partner that can squat 750 pounds raw. Wow. We put the electrodes over his glutes. There's no gluteal activity. It's all quads. So people say, oh, I know when I squat, my glutes function. I'm like, no, I've got guys that can squat 700, 800, 900 pounds. It may be within an individual that they could, but so if you're just giving these random exercises, oftentimes they're not effective, or they may not be effective.
You've talked about hip movement. You've talked about foot strike. We mentioned cadence. I obviously this device is an accelerometer. It's going to measure the cadence. What do you do with that data? What is an optimal cadence? What do you do if someone's cadence is too slow, too fast? How do you coach that?
I would say I try to keep it between 160 and 180 if we can. We use some different music. We usually have people listen to music and so forth, and there's some tempo with that. So those are some simple things. But oftentimes, if I have my better runners, they oftentimes have coaches. So we bring the coaches in, and we have a coaches mode for this device as well, which is going to get better. So Yeah,
Good
so
idea.
it's I think what's distinct about running is most people don't realize it's a skill. And it
Right.
and it really requires a lot. I
Yeah.
think people just like I can just go out and run and we have I mean there's some data that indicated up to 80, and I say this all the time, up to there's data indicating there's up to 80% of all serious runners are injured during the year to the point where they need medical care. It's like that's insane. And again, I'm going to go back to my powerlifting. You would think, oh wow, if you're doing maximum, I'm going to be 60 years old, you're doing maximum deadlifts and squats, you're likely to get injured. It's like, no, I don't see very many injuries. In
Right.
powerlifting, the majority of the injuries I see will be in older individuals. It's going to be bench press. In fact, the last 3 to 4 meets, I've seen several pectoralis major muscle just terrible in guys over the age of 50. But you don't see
Wow.
that. So in powerlifting, it's different. But in running, oh my goodness, you see injury after injury after
Hmm.
injury. And the challenging thing, I believe, and this is one of the reasons we designed this device isn't necessarily it's not dictating what you do for treatment. If you have a certain coaching strategy, a certain intervention, try it. Our device is trying to just say, hey, are you moving efficiently? Do you have any significant asymmetries? Um, if you want to run, say, well, I'm more ideal for running forefoot, midfoot, heel strike. Try it. See what works best for the individual. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I think running is. That's what I was really intrigued. If I brought 10 different practitioners in and to evaluate you guys as runners, we probably would get 10 very distinctive approaches.
Right.
And I think that's absolute nonsense. I think there's a lot of ways to approach things, but very few effective ways to
Hmm.
train things. I will just share this with you. I also have a graduate degree in philosophy of science. So it's like there's lots of different approaches, but there's not very many effective approaches to anything. So, but I think we can do a much better job. I think
Yeah.
running is one of the more distinct activities where anybody can do it. And oftentimes it would be a very effective strategy for successful aging, but too many people injured and they just stop, they quit, which
Yeah.
Right.
especially like you guys just over 40. It's very rare for me, even in Eugene, to see runners over the age of 70. So I don't know. Do you guys have a lot of experience with 70 and older runners or?
A
We've
few.
got one guy. We got one guy in our local run club here in Kingston Springs that's 82, but he's an anomaly for sure. We don't
Yes.
see nearly as many folks over 70 doing it. Though I mean, I guess you see more and more of it, but I can see, I guess, as there's so many overuse injuries that come along with it. That all said, something I will say is when you run a lot over time, those overuse injuries do become less problematic. I think I'd be interested to see what that data looks like. The 80%. I've heard that. I've even heard as much as like 90 or more percent of runners have a significant injury that puts them out of running for at least a few months every year or something like that. But I wonder what the data breakdown is when we get to runners that are more seasoned, where you kind of see like a lot of strengthening in their fascia and their tendons and those sorts of things versus, when you're mixing in the guy that just, maybe runs like 10, 15 miles a week.
Well, and
Right.
then yeah, again, you with the more seasoned runners, one of the variables you need to consider is they've been injured so many times that they're smarter in
That's
their
Right.
true.
training. It could be as
Yeah.
simple as that, or it's the strongest. I know another strong formal background I have is in biological anthropology, and it would be the strongest survive. It's like you look at who does really well in the Olympic sports. There's a certain body type for every sport. It's like if
Hmm.
you're a really good cyclist, they all look the same. If you're pretty good, there's
Right.
always statistical outliers, which I hate doing. People like, well, I know somebody that doesn't fit like that's great,
Yeah.
but in the
There's
bell
always
shaped
one.
curve, yeah, look at all the the swimmers. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness! I mean, if you're not 6'6" or 6'8", you're not gonna. It doesn't matter how good you are. I mean, those guys are Michael Phelps is gonna be halfway
I
across the pool by the time he jumps in.
The
So I think
pterodactyl wingspan.
yeah,
You
so I
know.
think with runners, it was very, it was very interesting looking at the different, the 100 meter, 200, the 800, the mile runners. It was a great learning experience. I never get bored with running. I think it's fascinating. My focus right now is also, again, I started powerlifting about 3 years ago because at the age of 57,
Oh,
I
about
just noticed I
recently.
was getting slower. And yeah, I wanted to find something I could still be competitive within myself and still get better at. And I think with
Yeah.
running, I was just getting slower. I was getting injured more often. I think right now this device is going to help. I'm going to start back to trail running here this summer. Right now, it's kind of a trade-off. I was on a podcast yesterday where I was sharing with one of the guys that I'm putting pressure on myself by saying this, but I've got a really good chance in the fall here to break 3 of the 4 world records in my age group for powerlifting.
Oh,
And the
wow.
running just tends to exacerbate my back a little bit. So
Mm.
it's more of a trade-off. So I kind of want to get to see if I can break these world records. And then I'm in the next age group, 60 to 64. So hopefully break the records. Then I'm going to step back for a while, get back into trail running. And then, yeah, that's the nice thing about powerlifting too. If you guys get into it, every 4 to 5 years, you change into the next group so you can do a little
It's
better.
A
And
little
it's
better,
really
yeah.
kind of, yeah,
yeah.
well, I mean, if you're, I have a 98-year-old a world champion powerlifter
Wow.
woman right now.
Wow.
So
That's
that's pretty
incredible.
cool. I don't
Oh,
have a
Very cool.
98-year-old runner though, but I think if we train people a little smarter, we could keep them running into their 70s and 80s, which maybe could be very helpful for their emotional and psychological state, like you guys know,
absolutely.
for the anxiety and so forth. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing about running is I think it is great. I think a lot of us kind of use that as our mental health care, probably in an unfortunate way. So
That's
getting a little bit back to the device though, I'm kind of curious too on longer runs. We've talked about 5 mile runs, even marathon distance, and I don't even know what the battery life looks like on your device, but ha- I'd be really curious to see what the data looked like on, say, like a 50 mile or a 75 mile or a 100 mile race, because you go through, like when I'm running those distances, you go through so much physical change. I mean, literal physical change within, just hours. I mean, just for instance, I mean, if I run a 100 mile race, I'm going to weigh 15 pounds less at the end of that race than I started it, at least. And there's all kinds of highs and lows through that, of course, and you get bursts of energy where you feel just fine, and you get hit really low points where like you're obviously feeling heavily injured and so on. So has your device been used on many athletes that have done these like ultra distances, starting with maybe the 50K going out to like maybe 100 miles?
No, because it's not yet, but we plan on that this summer actually, because the device is we just released a new user interface just on Monday. So we have a
oh,
whole
wow.
new So this thing is completely ready to go. And I can tell you I went back and did like I said, I'm going to be around, I'm obsessed with the age of 60. I tell everybody that because I look back growing up in Detroit thinking, my goodness, when I was 30, all of my 60-year-old uncles were very, very old and their life was almost
Yeah.
over and they were amazing people and they lived hard and they work hard and I respect the heck out of them. But um,
It's not as old as it used
yeah,
to be.
Yeah.
I went back at age 37 and did started my PhD. So I would say, one of my primary interests the next 20 plus years, if I have that much intellectual power left, is the research element of this. Absolutely. So we're at what I'm hoping is that people are interested in this device and are intellectually curious. I see this as more of a community project. Is we get a bunch of the ultra runners. That's why I'm hoping maybe like
Yeah.
we get Cam Haynes involved at some point as well in his group and I have several other friends that are ultra runners over in Eugene that I need to talk to now that the device is ready to go. It didn't have it has the battery life to go that long. So
Okay.
it
Okay.
wasn't available before. And again, we would have lost a Bluetooth connection. We don't lose that. We tried to break this device, but we need the feedback from individuals. Ultimately, what I'd like to do with this as well, we'll throw in other variables like VO2 max. We'll measure
Yeah.
Yeah.
nutritional. We can take all of these variables of your diet and other elements and put them into the machine learning. Instead, if you get 2, 3 million people, we're going to have some pretty good predictive power. There's not a device like this. I'm always confused that people are not more intellectually curious.
Mm.
I like to mess with all types of things. That's why I actually with the powerlifting in the last three years, I've had
Yeah.
quite a bit of fun realizing I thought maybe powerlifting was kind of like running. Anybody could do it. But once you get to a more elite level, there's a crazy amount of biomechanical knowledge that goes into play to get to the next level. And there's a lot of
Absolutely.
strategy. We have 3 lifts in powerlifting. We're seeing more older lifters as well, especially men and women. But you have a squat, you have a bench, and you have a deadlift. And you do all 3 of those in the same day over maybe about 4 to 6 hours, and you have 3 attempts at each. So let's say you open up with the squats. If I open up too heavy, let's say I was at the World Championships, I opened up at 402. You have 3 judges, and if you don't get that first lift, and you miss the second lift, you can't go back down and wait. So then if you miss all 3 lifts, you bomb out of the meet. So you got to be very selective. You get 3 attempts with the bench, 3 with the deadlift. And let's say you break a world record in the squat and the bench press, you open up too heavy on your deadlifts because you're trying to get a very high total, and then you don't get any of your deadlifts, all the records are wiped out for the day. Nothing counts.
Yeah.
So there's a lot so I like that strategy. And I think we could apply some of the same principles to running for sure. And powerlifting tends to attract, I think, a little more of an introverted individual. But I think, like, if you look at, is it Ryan Hall? That's the former marathon runner? Look at that guy now. He does the 500-pound deadlift and then runs under the. Yeah, I think he's a shining example of where a lot of people could be kind of mixed the running with the heavy lifting training with the. I think as we get older, I read a tremendous amount of research on aging. And in fact, one of the reasons I'm moving back over to Eugene is to start I had a nonprofit research institute for about 5 years in Eugene. And then we shut that down when I moved. But I'm going to start another research institute for aging. How do we successfully age?
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping to get a lot of retired professors in their 60s and 70s involved and talk to, because I think we can do it. So I think one of the key reasons runners end up injured, especially after the age of 40, I don't think they're taking into account how quickly their body is weakening. You know, at the age of 40, there's something very unique that happens. It's a term called sarcopenia.
Yep.
Sarcopenia means that the muscle cells, they don't just atrophy, get smaller, they disappear.
Right.
Starting at the age of 40, you lose about 1% of your muscle fibers per year. So by the time you're 60, you could have lost 20%.
Right.
After the age of 60, that process starts to accelerate. So if you take a runner and they're just running, but they're not keeping their body strong and they're losing muscle fibers, well, then the mechanical load doesn't go into the muscle. It goes into, the soft tissue elements and the bone elements. So the 1 to 2 days of strength training a week, even 1 day a week of resistive training can make a tremendous benefit. In fact, if you were to say, what would I prioritize? Flexibility, cardio, or strength training? If you were older and you could only do one, I 100% would say strength training. The evidence is just overwhelming, for a number of different reasons. So,
Tony, write that down. Sean, we're always giving Tony flack on the show because he doesn't like to strength train, so it's a recurring theme that Tony does not like. He doesn't like weights.
I like to run, and I always say that I'm doing my strength training when I'm going uphill. But so I can think of one device that's kind of similar to yours, but it sounds like your interface is probably better than that, because I have this device, and maybe you can tell me how you differ. Are you aware? The Garmin HRM Pro, it's their heart rate monitor, has an accelerometer in it as well. It gives you cadence, vertical oscillation, ground contact time, stride length, and vertical ratio. So it does give you some of those dynamics. But of course, it's also located in a different spot too, which probably affects that, because of course it's chest strap. So it's you put it like you would place any standard chest strap device. And of course, if you have a Garmin watch, you can look at those dynamics while you're wearing it, and like the 2 screens that you get is like, basically, are you favoring a side or something like that. Is this device significantly different than that device?
Yeah, and number one with Garmin, we're getting close to being able to use the device with the Garmin.
That'd be awesome.
So
yeah.
that's awesome. Something. Yeah, that'll be version 2 or 3. There's just been so many things that we need to get done here. It's overwhelming. When we first designed this device, we looked at what everything else did, and we said, well, let's just do something unique. So we created 38 metrics that nobody understood. So even some of the physics guys. So what we did is I said, why don't we take everything that these other devices have, like Garmin, let's include most of those metrics. So we
Yeah.
have most of those metrics within our device, plus our unique force portraits and other variables. So right now we can measure the holy grail, I would say, at least my interest is shock absorption. And we're very close to being able to do that with this device. So when
That'd
you
be
land
great.
on one leg or the other, it's like, how much load are you? And then the question would be why? So yes, and the other thing is since it's not the arm swing with the Garmin on there definitely has an impact on the metrics.
Yeah.
So
Because
I think
the
that's
rate's right up here. So
yeah, and you can play around. You can play around with it. You
yeah.
can see yourself. I mean, that's kind of like with our
Yeah.
device. You can play around with this, and it's centered right over the pelvis. One of the challenges we have now is I ideally, I think I'm not sure with the timeline, it won't be that long, but this device now, you need a belt to clip it on. But hopefully we're going to have we'll have some clothes that you can just slip it in to make it really, really
Yeah.
tight over the pelvis. There'll be certain body types where this device won't work because it
Yeah.
moves too much. But we'll work on those variables as we get the feedback. But yeah, very interesting that question on the arms. And again, all you have to do with any device is just play with it. Run outside,
Right.
exaggerate your arm swing and say, holy cow, this device is
Yeah.
questionable in terms of its reliability.
I think that the location, is what I find most interesting, this, especially the early conversation we had about how, you're back to the hips. Because I mean, I in conversations you have with people, it does seem like a lot more problems originate from the hips than we even think about. And this is just casual conversation people have. And that location of putting it on your sacrum is really, seems like a good spot to put it. Um, to measure that makes it definitely a unique thing. I look forward to doing even more research into your device.
Yeah.
It's really really interesting.
Say there's a reason it's called the sacrum. It's a sacred region. It's what's really unique. I've done a tremendous amount of anatomy, cadaver human dissections. I taught anatomy and so forth at a couple of different universities. And at the University of Michigan, where I went to graduate school, I was the assistant for the anatomy lab. But I can take apart the body pretty quickly, the entire body, but I cannot get the tissue off of the sacrum. So every 10 from the upper body and the lower body, that's where it converges. So it's a really unique area. Everybody always talks about key areas of the body. I think that's the key area where everything comes together. It's right back. So there's a reason. I've got research to back it up theoretically as to why that's an ideal region to place it in terms of measuring forces from above and below.
So I wanted to ask you about the app too, because does the app, once it's recorded the force portrait, does the app itself have actionable recommendations for form improvement, cross training? Is anything like that included, or is that on the horizon? Is that planned for a future version?
Yes, right now, let's say that you have the force portrait indicates that you've got too much an excessive hip mobility or sway. You'll click on and there's 2 to 3 videos to show you how to correct that. And then the same thing would be a lack of hip mobility and or braking. There's lots of little cues. If there's a problem, it tells you how you can correct it. And within the next month, probably within the next 4 to 6 weeks, we're going to create about another 50 to 60 videos of instructions that will link in. So here's what we suspect the problem may be. Click on, it's going to show you things that you can do to try to correct it and or work with your coach or provide the feedback and maybe we can do that for you as well.
And do I need to tell the app when I'm experiencing certain types of pain, lower back, knee, ankle, foot, whatever, with plantar fasciitis, whatever it is, if I input my symptoms, will it consider that when it's examining my force portrait?
Yes and no. So right now, yes, it's very important. I mean, for your own log, that's one of the things that's distinct. There's a human anatomy portrait you're going to put in where your symptoms are. That's going to help us because as we collect this data, with what you're seeing subjectively, and your force portrait, we're going to put all this thing in the machine learning over the next several years. Yeah, that's going to help the community at large. One of the interesting things about, like, let's just say an example, a very common issue. Have you guys had plantar fasciitis before? That'd be the bottom of the foot. Have either of you experienced that?
I have.
I've been blessed to avoid it, but
yeah. Or how about Achilles tendonitis? The Achilles
a lot
tendon?
of that.
Yeah. Knock on wood. I've never had that one.
Yeah, people think that the challenge there is that people think those are distinct regions. There's no difference between the Achilles tendon and the plantar fascia. They're the same structure. but we
Huh.
separate them out. And I can argue this, and I know that people are going to kind of want to argue nuance with me, but when we look at the body, that's a continuation. The gastroc muscles and the soleus muscles, that Achilles tendon actually is a long tendon that expands down into the bottom of your foot. So oftentimes people will focus on foot pain on the foot itself, where really what you oftentimes need to do is go into the calf muscle. And you can roll the calf muscle because as the calf muscle shortens, what it does is it pre-stretches the tendon, the Achilles tendon and the plantar fascia, which is just an extension. We call that an aponeurosis. So then you could say, well, why am I using excessive calf? Well, because the calf muscle is going to be overworking if you lack hip extension. So then again, we get up the chain. So if I wanted to affect the foot and the Achilles tendon region, one way I can do that is to increase my hip mobility, because then my muscles will start working a little more efficiently. So with all of these, oftentimes the question becomes when you have pain somewhere is why is that region being overloaded?
Right.
That's the way I look at it from it. If my right SI joint hurts, the pain may be coming from the tissue in that region, but how do I unload it? So I try to figure out, okay, do I have a left hip that's not moving? Do I have the opposite shoulder that's not moving? If I clean up the mechanics and then I can treat the region that hurts more effectively and then I improve, or maybe I've got muscle weakness in that area. Let's say my SI joint hurts. Oftentimes, if I have pain on the right side of the hip, it's because the left side of the hip isn't moving well. So it may be causing an increased mechanical loading into the side that hurts. And that's hopefully what this device will help you play with. And I think over time, I think people are much more intuitive than they give themselves credit for. I would say one of the last things on these force portraits, when we started designing this tool about 7 to 8 years ago, our culture was very different. I remember showing these force portraits to a lot of our Olympic runners, and they were immediately excited. They're like, oh my goodness, if I win the Olympics with your device and I have that force portrait, I'm going to put that up on my wall as a portrait. And I actually patented all the
That's
artwork based
cool.
on work with. And what's happened in the last 7 years is people have lost their intellectual curiosity. They're no longer, the majority of people don't look at that portrait and try and figure out what it means. They're like, well, what does it mean? I don't want to have to think this thing through. And it's like, my
Spoon
goodness,
feed
it's
it to
like,
me.
yeah, spoon feed it. So it's called the aesthetics of the smooth. It's a philosophical approach that thinks that we've gotten away from our inherent sense of what beauty is. And our new sense of beauty is things need to be smooth, clean, easily digestible and consumable. And I think with these force portraits, I think we can hopefully get people to start thinking, wow, that's interesting. That's an interesting pattern I have. I wonder what I can do to change that. And what does that mean? I would say also I can go on forever with this stuff, but one of the unique things about that force portrait, it's called, the device is called Aletheia, which is Greek for disclosure. And our company is called Project Dasein. And Dasein is a German word meaning how I as a human being interact with the world. So within your force portrait is your past, your present, and your future. Everything in that force portrait is a result of your past that got you here. And everything is also in that force portrait an anticipation of what lies within your future. So there's a whole lot more involved in these force portraits. I think that can make it more intellectually stimulating. Everything's within that. Yeah, and that's you. It's unique unto you and how you interact with the world and the world interacts with you. I think that's what makes running great, especially outside, is as a culture, as a world. I think what was different 100 years ago, 200 years ago, is we interacted with our environment much more. And now we spend too much time, videos and so forth. I mean, I know that's all in the social psychology literature, but I also think that that's one of the biggest reasons we have so much anxiety and depression, especially in the younger individuals. So if we can get people outside more with using this device, the device initially down the road, I like to share this with everybody. My main goal with this device, it may have started out with running. We're also now doing research. It'll be used for people that just want to walk, especially older people that just, and then it's going to be used for hopefully for patients with Parkinson's.
Oh, wow.
Parkinson's right now, there's literature out of the University of Southern California with Beth Fisher. She's showing if you can take individuals with Parkinson's and then at different stages and run them, that it can improve their overall Parkinsonian symptoms. Now here becomes a challenge, and I've been corresponding with Beth Fisher. I've had her up to my clinic. The challenge you get with somebody with Parkinson's is they're deconditioned and they move very asymmetrically depending on their stage. So they oftentimes get injured, and then they can't walk and they can't run and they become more depressed. So
It's worse.
So what I'm hoping with this device is that, let's say you have Parkinson's, and then we'll set the device up that we allow a certain threshold of asymmetry. And then what will happen, let's say you run for 10 minutes. If you have Parkinson's, you run for 10 minutes and now you're too asymmetrical. Well, you'll be running in an area where you could sit down for 5 to 10 minutes and then see if the body's energy gets restored. And then you can run again, so we can get some objective data and establish a better training program for these patients with Parkinson's, because it's an incredibly devastating disease. I would say I have a friend that about a month ago, his Parkinsonian so bad he was home and he walked into a door and his body just froze for over an hour. He just stood there and couldn't move. It was horrible.
Man.
His family wasn't there. So I think if we can get these people running more effectively, that could be a really, really powerful. And I'd like to share that with the community. There are so many things that we could do with this device. This device is not telling you how to run. It's a tool. How can we use the tool? Well, we can probably use it in many different fashions, but we need everybody to share that information with us so we can get better and better. That's my goal for the next 20 years, or whatever I have left of what I have left here. So I don't have any other goals other than that.
I really I've actually really enjoyed this conversation a lot. And I loved your approach. How you started off at the beginning when you talked about how you approach your patients. You look at their background, and then you try to relate to them from kind of their ideological framework that they're coming from. But also, I've really enjoyed the fact that this device provides you some insight into your running form, but then also just the idea that I always look at running, and especially trail running, as just a beautiful human action, and it's just this way that we see so much loss of our interaction with the environment that we as humans should be interacting with. And I love the way you kind of bring that to the whole picture of this of what this device does first off, but also just to humans and the way we interact with the environment, and the fact that running is kind of an act of beauty, and we should be able to see the beauty in that. So
if our listeners do want to test out a device, where can they find it? Is it available on the market yet?
Yes, it's AletheiaRun.com, and there's also an Instagram site as well. But yeah, it's a website. I have 4 children. My son has a couple engineering degrees. He designed that whole website and the user interface. And then I have a daughter who's a physicist and a cinematographer, so she helps with all that as well. So those are 2 of my children that help quite a bit. But yeah, like I said, just a few days ago, the new user interface came up. Right. And then my other team we wouldn't be where we are without Cooper, who's been involved in this for over 14 years. His background his formal degree is in physics. And I like working with physicists because it gets us away from the subjectivity. I think if there's any activity that's too subjective, I would say it's running. If you brought 10 powerlifting elite coaches in, there would be very little discrepancy between how they would train powerlifters. There might be some nuance, but I don't think you could find very little commonality between 10 people that are coaching or treating runners. It's all over the map. But again, this device isn't telling you what to do. It's just showing you. It's going to challenge some people. You might have some ideas of saying, well, it's better, like, let's say that one of the big arguments, I don't want to go too far down the road with this, is like, well, let's take heel strikers and make them 4-foot runners. They'll decrease their injury rate. Our experience over in Eugene with many, many runners, and when you change their running style, they oftentimes ended up injured.
Because they've adapted to the running style they're used to.
Yeah, if you take a 4-foot, I had some of my more semi-elite runners, which would be people that qualify for the Olympic trials. They got faster by going from a heel strike to a toe strike, but then they were injured all the time.
Right.
And so that's when I'd have to sit that down with a lot of those individuals and say, hey, I think, you're 28 years old. I think you peaked out. You're not going to get better, and you're always injured. So maybe let's look at another activity. Very easy to do with the women, very hard to do with the men. I think they like to stick on to their 32 or 33, sometimes thinking they're going to get better, but that doesn't happen, not very often.
That is a tough, it's a tough pill to swallow that you can't turn back the clock, but
Yeah.
that's life.
Yeah, but there's so many. I think if you can, well, my goal is that I think there's a lot of amazing things that can happen as we get older. I think we just have to
Absolutely.
recognize where those opportunities lie. And I see way too many of what's very interesting in my patient load I started as an athlete trainer in 1985 and went to University of Michigan for PT school in the early 90s. I find that most men, as they get older, they do less and less. They don't run, they don't lift weights. It's the women that become a lot more active. And I know that there's many variables there psychologically, but it's one of the reasons I switched over to powerlifting, because I wanted to find something that I could actually get a little bit better at.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, but again, I think we need to do something with men in general to get them more active, so that they're more happy contributors to their family as well, and so
Right.
they don't get all grumpy when they get into their 60s.
That's
and
right.
shut it down. But yeah, I think there's a lot that I think we can age much more successfully than what we've done in the past here.
Couldn't agree more.
Better. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. Well, Sean, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. This has been really interesting, and I really look forward to trying out the device. And we'll link to all this stuff in the show notes again. So if you want to check one out for yourself, just check us out on Substack, and we'll have the link there.
Yeah, and if you guys have any other questions, I mean, thank you very much for your time. But I mean, just email me if you got questions or want any research articles, or if you want to talk about any other ideas, and then I'm always available. That's kind of where I'm at right now in my life.
I'd love to see some of those articles. That's for sure. I would love to flip through that and see some of the data, in as much as I'll be able to process it.
Oh, they're. I think you'll be able to get something out of them. Okay. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, and best of luck with that world record.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Please make sure to like or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We also list the show notes and have lots of bonus content available on Substack or Instagram.